responsible for initiating the TIF effort. So once a municipality may be interested in initiating the TIF district, so municipal officials might be, or a TIF district could be initiated by a developer who's interested in putting in a shopping mall, or some mixed-use development in a particular area. So the TIF process can be initiated either outside the walls of City Hall or from the city, a city or a municipality itself. So in order to designate the TIF district, as I said, a finding of blight and but-for needs to be made, and that's made in something called an eligibility report, which is basically just sort of a statement saying that these two criteria have been met. And then the state legislation, the enabling legislation that is passed in each state, sets out the requirements for what the physical boundaries of the TIF or the proposed redevelopment area has to be. So in Illinois, a project area has to be at least 1 1/2 acres inside. In size, the parcels have to be contiguous, and they have to contain only properties that will be substantially benefited by the proposed TIF plan. If you look at TIF districts, if you look at maps of them, you see that they're very irregularly shaped. And in reality, the process sort of lends itself to a lot of gerrymandering that's due to, sort of whether or not a TIF crosses ward boundaries, or trying to capture those properties that are potentially at their sort of lowest value but have the potential, have the sort of probability of increasing in value over time. So the eligibility study is written. There has to be a redevelopment plan, which is basically a wish list of what the municipal officials would like to see take place within that TIF district. There are public hearings where the opponents can vocalize their discontent with the TIF. Supporters can come out and voice their support for the TIF. But in Illinois, there's no affirmative obligation on the part of the municipality to sort of take into account whether or not there is opposition, or whether a certain percentage of property owners in the district are not supportive of the TIF. That doesn't really matter. It's just that their opinions are essentially registered. And then the municipality is sort of free to move on. And then what happens in the city of Chicago, and actually I think the BGA has done a very nice job. There's a handout in the back that goes through the process as sort of translated in the city of Chicago. The last step is that the city council would essentially pass an ordinance that would designate the area as a TIF district. And then an account would be created where the TIF funds would accumulate. So how do funds accumulate in a TIF district? This is sort of the mechanism of how TIF works. So once an area is designated as a TIF district, so the city council has passed that ordinance, the initial property value of all the properties in that district, in the redevelopment area, is tabulated. They're added up. So the cumulative value of all the parcels within the district at the moment of designation, that's what's called the base value, or the initial assessed value. In theory, after the designation of the TIF district, private development should be attracted to the area for a variety of reasons. One is because the municipality uses its powers of site clearance and relocation, utility installation, street repair to improve the district. So you have a lot of private developers who are drawn to the area because it's now been improved. There's better infrastructure there. Developers might be attracted to the TIF because the municipality, in designating the TIF, is signaling that it will subsidize land assembly and sale, thereby reducing a developer's own equity costs, the amount of money that a developer would have to put up, and that essentially lowers the developer's mortgage payments. The developer might be attracted to the area because the city can also use these TIF funds to subsidize the financing for a developer who wants to invest in that area, which lowers the financial risks, makes the project look more financially viable from the developer's perspective. So if all this development is attracted to the area after the TIF has been designated, we would expect the assessed value of the properties in that area, in the district, and its taxes to rise. And that's why you see this slope of the line, on the top line, going up over time. What we call the tax increment, is basically just the difference between the base value, so the value of all the property in the area at the moment of designation, and any subsequent appreciation. So that area in orange is the increment. So instead of channeling this increment, the difference between the property values in year X and in the year of designation, instead of channeling them into the city's general fund, and where the dollars would be distributed and allocated through sort of normal budgeting procedures, through the usual sort of power play of politics. If they're in the general fund, or if they were part of the sort of the municipality or the region's base, other taxing jurisdictions would get to apply their individual tax rates to the addition to the increment. So instead of that taking place, the funds have to be used within the TIF district where they're generated. In public administration, public policy, we call this the flypaper effect. Basically trying to pin down revenues where they're generated instead of sending them to other parts of the municipality. People, that's a very sort of popular attitude. I don't want my property tax dollars being used on the north side if I'm on the south side, and vice versa. So TIF is a way of sort of pinning down those property values where they're designated, or at least in theory. The city of Chicago has been known to port, what we call, move TIF increment that's generated one TIF to other TIF districts. But in theory, that's the basis, the sort of theoretical foundation, or the justification for TIF is that you get to use what you generate. So if you have a lot of increment, if you are able to increase your property values by a large degree, there's a lot of sort of money to play with there. So from the developer's side, this means that once the TIF is in place, a developer can ask for assistance. So they can go hat in hand to the municipality and ask for money to pay for things like acquiring property, demolishing existing buildings, renovating or constructing buildings, installing or relocating streets, utilities, the infrastructure word. So there's a lot of sort of very good public uses that this increment can be used for, a lot of things that sort of developers and businesses other than just the developer who's sort of asking for the assistance might benefit from. And then there are more sort of firm-specific ways in which a developer can benefit, such as decreasing the interest rate that they're able to access to pay for this new development. How much a developer can get from the city, that's sort of the million-dollar question. That's the sort of least regulated aspect of this whole TIF thing. Sort of the least legible to those of us trying to study the process. And this is one of the reasons why TIF gets sort of opened up to accusations of cronyism and nepotism and abuse, is because this is, you're basically saying, if you're going to develop within a TIF district, there's public assistance to help you. And how the city or the municipality sort of comes up with a subsidy package, how it decides how much money to give you, is very much sort of a behind closed doors kind of an arrangement. The city likes to comes up with sort of principles. For example, at certain points it said, we don't like to pay more than 20% of total development costs, project costs, or 30% of project costs. But in reality, there's a lot of variation in how much some developers get a fair amount, or like a large share of their development costs taken care of with our property tax dollars, and others not so much. So a lot of developers have had a hard time getting public assistance, and others have had an easier time doing that. The problem with TIF, and then I'll shut up, is that it sort of works on the principle that we're going to use now what is going to be generated in the future. So there's a fair amount of sort of financial engineering that needs to take place so that developers can actually access that money now when they need it, when they want to build, so that the property values will eventually go up. So the city uses several different kinds of what we call front funding techniques. So in some cases, and this is true of a lot of the early TIFs in the city of Chicago, the city itself went to the bond market and bonded for a project and used the proceeds from the bond to pay for the infrastructure expenditures that were needed. What's become more common is that the city will give what is called a note, which is a form of short-term debt, to a developer, and the developer will be responsible for either monetizing that note, sort of selling that note to financial markets, or getting a loan from the bank that's secured by that note in order to get the money now. So TIF, in addition to just providing these different forms of subsidies to developers, is also a way of getting over the kind of lumpiness of cash flow. The fact that developers need money now, even though the property tax revenues are going to be generated in the future. So I was trying to talk abstractly about just what TIFs are, as opposed to how TIFs have been used in the city of Chicago, which was my understanding of what our discussion would be. So,
Rachel, thank you. That's extraordinarily helpful. And let me just say, as somebody who, as a longtime news reporter, covered stories on TIF, without the deep understanding of the people in this panel, I think it finally sunk into our thick heads that what was really happening is that there's a finite number of tax dollars, and a decision had been made to allocate a large number of them to TIF development, and those dollars had to come from someplace else, and so they came from schools and municipal government and county government. And the argument now is, what is best use? I think in good economic times, when public sector revenues are flowing in large numbers, there theoretically is enough for all of it. And presumably, municipalities have their money, and schools get theirs, TIF districts get theirs. And I think for a lot of years in Chicago, to some extent, that happened. But as we've noticed now, when we see a city $600 million in the red, and a state $13 billion in the red, and a county that had to impose the highest sales tax in the country to balance its budget, that the loss of those revenues was felt deeply and acutely. And when questions arise about whether those revenues are even being spent reasonably in the TIF districts, or whether or not they're a slush fund, as Ben called them, or payoffs to certain developers, then the public policy question becomes very intense.